Welcome to this audio session recording taken at the Agroforestry Show, which was organised in September 2023 as a partnership between the Woodland Trust and the Soil Association. For more session recordings, go to agroforestryshow.com or explore and subscribe to the Agroforestry Show YouTube channel. Enjoy!
Okay, welcome. My name's Clive Thomas. I work for the Soil Association. And we're really pleased to be launching our short report today titled The Case for Regenerative Farm-Scale Forestry. And before I introduce our excellent panel who are going to make individual contributions on this topic during the next sort of hour or so, I just want to spend a few moments sort of locating this work for you and perhaps being quite honest by saying that what huge excitement there is here at this show and sort of generally around agroforestry over the last 4 to 5 years, perhaps a bit longer than that now. But, as those of you that attended the welcoming from Helen Browning at the start of the show, this is the moment where we felt confident enough to organise an agroforestry show, the first one in the UK, along with our partners, the Woodland Trust. And that movement really is trying to encourage the integration of more trees into farming systems, and for all the benefits that you can learn about at this show, and many of you already know about. But what we sort of unapologetically want to focus on in this session, and what we focused on in this report, is all the trees that are already on farms. So those of you haven't had a chance to read it yet, but again, most of you probably are aware of some of the sort of overall stats, which I'll drill into in a little bit more detail in a moment. But approximately 1/3 of all the woodland in the UK, so there's just over 3 million hectares of woodland in the UK, and 1 million hectares, 1.1 million hectares actually, is reported as being on an agricultural holding. And we're kind of defining that, as does the forestry statistics, we're kind of defining that as farm woodland. And we really want to focus on that component of a farm in this session and in this report, and really think about how this sort of excitement around agroforestry can help us with that really important resource, because that resource has been there for a while now. Although the trend is upwards, farmers are planting trees as woodland, despite some of the headlines. That resource on farm tends to get characterised in a very negative way. So perhaps from the more traditional forestry sector, it will get characterised as small scale, uneconomic, difficult to access, not worth bothering with. From the nature conservation perspective, and these are all true, what I'm saying, but I'm just talking about the framing and the characterisation. From the nature conservation perspective, we know that woodland resource, in fact, all of our small woodland resource in the UK is in very poor ecological condition. So those have kind of been known, and I've been around forestry now for too many years to mention, really, but this is something that we've been kind of focusing on as a policy problem for many, many years now, with very little traction or solution, with some notable exceptions. And again, we profile those in the report, and you'll hear a bit more about those in the sort of panel session. But what we wanted to do was try and sort of turn it around a little bit, and try and think about this from a different direction. So think about it from the farmer's direction. Think about the opportunities and the potential benefits that are being celebrated at this show around agroforestry and integrating trees into a farming system. But what about the potential benefits of the trees that are already in the woodland on a farm? And now, clearly some of those could be operated as agroforestry systems. I've already been to a session this morning where a farmer was talking about the careful integration of his sheep in a silvopastoral system into a woodland. So it could go in that direction, and there's many other different directions it could go in. But we want to sort of focus on that now, and we also want to think about the products from those woodlands, not just the services, but the products, the timber products, the fibre products, and the other sort of potential contributions that could be made to a farm enterprise to the bottom line. Okay, so hopefully that sort of locates this report for you. For those of you that are interested in reports more generally, we did produce our regenerative forestry report last year. And really this report that we're launching today sits under this main report. This is available, we don't have very many hard copies of this. This is available on our website as a digital download. But in that report, some of the things that I've already touched on in this introduction, we were sort of trailing really. And I guess our conclusion was about forestry generally in the UK was, you know, the woodlands that are being managed, the woodlands that are already delivering benefits, along with the woodlands that perhaps we're going to focus on today and deliberately call them farm woodlands. They need to be thought about in a much more integrated and sort of resilient and restorative way. And to kind of sort of come back to what I said at the start about why the Soil Association has produced this report, if ever there was a resource in the UK that would benefit from a focus on its restoration and its management, I would argue that it's the farm woodland resource. Not just for all the public policy benefits that we all like to talk about, but how about we try and approach this from a different direction and approach it from a farmer's perspective and what the benefits could be to the farm enterprise. And again, that's some of the things that we profile in the report. Okay, so I'm going to stop speaking in a moment, but I'm just going to introduce our three speakers. They'll introduce themselves in a bit more detail when we get to each of them. But what's great about this panel is that we have Ashley Hardacre from Bangor University. And Ashley is not going to be deeply academic, but it's going to be some sort of observations and insights, perhaps from a more sort of academic perspective in terms of this topic. We've then got David Brown from Broadleaf, Wales, one of the case studies that's profiled in the report. He's actually doing this. He's a farmer. He's growing high-quality trees and has been for years. So we'll hear from David, and hopefully that will be really inspiring. And then finally, we'll hear from Ollie Rodker from the Land Workers Alliance. And what's been really interesting is that our two organisations do a lot of work together over the years, and we're often coming from a very similar perspective. And coincidentally, because Ollie and I hadn't actually spoken in recent months, we were both working on something quite similar. So the report that we're launching today, and Ollie will be talking to you about a report that the Land Workers Alliance launched back in, I think, April, called The Cutting Edge, which again is profiling some of what we're talking about today, maybe with a bit more of a livelihood and social dimension to it as well. So some really good contributions that I'm looking forward to. Final slide from me, just so that we're, you know, I mentioned some of this at the top, but just so we're really clear on definitions here, and what we do know and what we don't know. We do acknowledge that in the report. So we're taking as our definition of farm woodland, the woodland that is registered on an agricultural holding somewhere in the UK. And this is all reported through the agricultural censuses, and then it's then reported in forestry statistics. So when I tell you that there's 1.1 million hectares of farm woodland, I'm drawing that evidence base from that process, really, that self-reporting agricultural census process. Now, many of you who are maybe contributing to that census process, you know, I'm the first to acknowledge that the quality of the data here is based on self-reporting and a lot of inference. But I think because of what we know about the 2 million hectares that isn't reported as part of an agricultural holding, I think we can take that broad figure, that 1.1 million hectares, as being broadly accurate. But there's a lot we don't know. So, as I say, as a forester, this has had a sort of, I wouldn't say it's had much sort of policy intervention in terms of doing anything about it, but certainly from a sort of a big concern, it's been talked about for years, this woodland resource, this small woodland resource on farm. But we don't actually know that much about it. We can infer some sort of knowledge about it from those statistics that are reported annually. So we know that that total has been growing quite significantly in recent years. Hence, what I said at the start, that farmers are planting woodland, despite some of the headlines. But we don't know much about the actual age structure of it, or even the species, really. It would have been in a grant scheme, probably a lot of it, but that hasn't necessarily followed through in terms of the sort of detailed understanding we have of it. So this kind of inference, again, that a lot of it's in poor ecological condition, that's because we know that most of the UK woodland is in poor ecological condition. Only 1% of our planted woodland is in good ecological condition. I think only 9% of our native woodland is in good ecological condition. So some of this resource will be sort of overlaid onto this farm woodland resource that we're focusing on today. So I just want to sort of get that acknowledgement out of the way. You know, this is deliberately a policy report. We're targeting policymakers here to help us better understand this. We need to be, we've had huge investment over the last 100 years in a particular model of forestry. We now need to get much more serious about these small woodlands and these farm woodlands. Okay, I'm going to sit down for the next bit because I'm going to have a bit of a conversation with Ashley. So Ashley, just to get us going, I'm sure you've probably got some observations just on anything I've already said, but I'm particularly interested in what I've said about what we do and don't know about this resource. So over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm particularly interested in farm woodlands because they're a fairly unloved part of the forestry sector, and they've typically been fairly unstudied for quite a long time. There was a rash of interest in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s about the concept of the farm woodland and what it means in the 20th century, but it's now sort of being overtaken by concepts such as agroforestry and regenerative farming, and it's become a little bit unloved again. But I think it's a really interesting context because it's this halfway house between, the foresters are not particularly interested in it. Farmers for a long time have become uninterested in this sort of part of the farm, and I think that's why it's quite an interesting context. Historically, the farm woodland was quite was an integral part of the farm. It was something that was managed for, creating inputs to the farm system. Timber for fencing, firewood for the farm. It was something you might throw the stock into in bad weather, and it was an integral part of the farm infrastructure. And sort of over the last the last century, that's become a little bit forgotten, and that's sort of quite similar to some of the same issues that are going on in sort of conventional agriculture. We're sort of rediscovering agroecology and rediscovering regenerative farming, but they historically were how farming was done, and the farm woodland was traditionally how forestry was done for a long period of time. But efficiency and progress and big timber has sort of pushed farm forestry way down the agenda. So I think it's a really interesting context to study in an academic capacity. Trees have become, in recent years, fairly weaponized in sort of policy debates. When the last general election, all the politicians were throwing out their pledges for how many trees they were going to plant as a competition to see who could, curry the most favour with the environmentalists. Recently, especially in Wales, trees have become another weapon in the big pushbacks against changes to farming policy. This whole 10% tree cover on farm to get your basic payment. Trees have become a weapon, and that's really putting the idea of managing woodlands on farms way down the agenda because there's people digging heels in on both sides. And there are skepticisms among the farming sector about managing woodlands and trees on farms, and there are there's big concerns among farmers in the rural sector about the forestry industry are hovering like vultures, waiting for kind of farming to fail, and then occupying that space with a kind of a pilot high, sell it cheap model of forestry. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, in the sense that is an efficient way of producing timber to build houses and sequester carbon. But that model it'll continue to kind of perpetuate unless we do something a bit different. And part of doing something a bit different is farmers opening the door to growing trees on farms, whether that be through an agroforestry system or maybe through something a bit more dense like a plantation. So there's multiple ways of which we can grow trees on a farm, and here we're talking about agroforestry, the whole event about agroforestry. And agroforestry is great. It's a really digestible way of getting trees into a farm because it kind of, it focuses around sort of fairly recognizable management activity that you're using trees as a tool to enhance production. And that's quite a light cultural shift for the farming sector. You're not really changing your livelihood system. But what we're talking about here, which is this managing denser blocks of woodland, things that are already on the farm or potentially new farm woodlands, that's quite a different management activity for someone who has been grazing sheep, growing crops their whole lives. So that's a big cultural shift, and it's a big change to a livelihood, but it's a really important part of the future for growing timber in the UK. In a really crowded landscape, there's not going to be a whole lot of space for massive big Sitka spruce plantations at the scale at which some of these big tree planting targets suggest we need to do. So that's why I think we're talking in this session here about opening that door to kind of farm forestry and growing trees for timber on farms.
Thanks, Ashley. So yeah, you're quite right. This sort of idea that we've lost really, I think, in the UK, which I think internationally is still much more prevalent, of farmers actually growing. It's another form of production. So alongside their crops, alongside their livestock, they're also growing some trees. And in many countries, actually, a lot of the heavy lifting on tree growing is done by farmers. So, very much agree with your sort of opening remarks there. Could you take us into the sort of next set of points you want to make around, what are those real opportunities? How can it really benefit the farm enterprise rather than, all the things that tend to get talked about, which are the public policy benefits, the benefits to me, I'm not a farmer, of the carbon that's being sequestered in that tree or the biodiversity that's over there. What about the benefits to the farm enterprise as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for a long time farmers have been pushed for new woodlands, new trees, new this, new that. And actually this existing resource is a really interesting way into managing woodlands on farms. It's already there. There's already a standing stock of trees. And I think one of the biggest opportunities is bringing some of that existing woodland back into management. I think one of the biggest cultural factors that sort of puts farmers off dealing with woodlands is that the cash flow cycles are very different to the yearly cycle of annual incomes from farming. If you're planting a tree and waiting 30 years for the check, that's quite a big mindset shift to go, actually, okay, there isn't that annual cash flow cycle. But if we're talking about these existing woodlands as an opportunity to go in and make periodic, shorter term interventions that are bringing income in on a sort of shorter cycle, perhaps closer to what you would be getting with your conventional agricultural enterprise, that's beginning to hook into having this forestry activity as part of the farm business. Some of those early interventions are not going to, they're not going to yield the most highest value, outputs. Some of the early interventions might well be some firewood, and then later on you're getting into smaller roundwood, and then perhaps eventually you'll get some really nice high value saw logs. But what it's doing is it's creating a journey through that management. You're starting small, and as you begin to grow, you're getting out higher value outputs as you go through the process. Alongside that kind of conventional woodland produces some timber that you can then use in construction and whatever else. There's a level of sort of additional kind of farm level benefits that I don't think have really been talked about in the context of a farm woodland. We talk about shelter and shade and tree fodder in the context of agroforestry, in the sense that we might put some silver pasture in, or some shelter belts, or some alley cropping as a source of additional feed and shade for your livestock. But equally, you can open the fence to your woodland and let your cattle in, let the sheep in at certain periods of the year. We just listened to Matt this morning talking about how he's been using his sheep in his woodland to enhance the biodiversity, but he's also found that there's some payback benefits that his sheep are coming out of that woodland much healthier. He's putting lame sheep in and they're coming out, pretty happy and healthy. So there's an additional level of economic benefit from that woodland that doesn't necessarily translate into cash in your back pocket. It's other inputs into that farm system. Likewise, woodlands on boundaries prevent that nose-to-nose contact, so you've got kind of biosecurity measures. One of the things that I don't like talking about, but I think we have to, is carbon. There's lots of talks here, and there's lots of talks that I've heard recently about, carbon is going to be the saviour of making woodlands pay. And to an extent, yeah, they're right, carbon does bring you some initial early income from your woodland. But by tying yourself up into that carbon, you're allowing you're allowing someone else to basically dictate what you're doing in your own woodland. So you're taking away your flexibility with what you can do. But that carbon actually is really important if you keep it within your farm system. So you think about the big retailers, Morrisons, Sainsbury's, they're having big pushes to reduce their scope-free emissions to get their, to reach their net zero pledges. And part of that is going to be working with their supply chains to get their farming suppliers down to net zero. And if you've sold off all your carbon from your woodland, you're never going to get yourself to net zero. But if you can keep that carbon from your well-managed woodland that's periodically producing you timber, producing inputs into the farm, it's then sequestering your residual emissions and it's keeping you potentially at a net zero level. So it's keeping that within your farm system. So I think with all of this, the opportunities for managing these farm woodlands are not necessarily directly getting cash in your back pocket, but it's about making that woodland part of the economic realities of your farm. So it's thinking about where do I derive value from it, and how does that value then feed into everything else that I do? And it may well be that it's you grow some timber, cut it down, sell it for construction or into some niche furniture making markets. Or it may be actually that farm woodland becomes something that's a living barn that you use in the winter or when it's droughty because it's nice and it's a nice place for your livestock to go. So the opportunity is really to think about how do I derive value from that woodland on the farm rather than how do I deliver value to the supply chain or to public benefits, which has been primarily the major reason why people are pushing farmers to manage woodlands. It's to get trees in the ground, to sequester carbon, and it's to deliver public goods that are a benefit to everyone else. And that bit in the middle about how does it benefit the farm system is what's really been forgotten in all of these debates, I think.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Before we move on to the next area, which is, okay, all those opportunities, but why isn't it happening more? I just want to do a shout out actually to one of the other case studies that's in the report. Victor Crutchley's farm, North Egerton farm, where he's done exactly some of the things that Ashley's just been talking about. So he's had a fortunate legacy of woodland that has been planted by previous generations, and it has saved him money in terms of some big on-farm projects that he wanted to take forward because he realised that he had some fantastic timber just next to where he wanted to do these projects. So rather than the perversity of farmers spending a lot of money bringing timber onto farm, he actually made that logical step and started realising the opportunity from his own farm woodlands. So yeah, take a look at that one in the report. But yeah, Ashley, just back to, you've just painted a really optimistic picture, and I think that's what we're trying to do in this report and this session. And at the end of this, I'll come back to some of the barriers and the solutions that we talk about in the report. But from your perspective, why isn't it happening more? Why are we just profiling in our report and in Ollie's report in a moment, a handful of people who are doing this rather than it necessarily being mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, when I was sort of preparing for this, I jotted down sort of five-ish main big problems that I think is what's sort of holding back this bit of, I don't want to call it the forest sector because it's sort of a halfway house, but I guess one of the biggest ones is stems from policy to a degree and the messaging that's going out there. When you look in the messaging coming from some of the forestry companies, it's a suggestion that managing a woodland for timber is going to save your farm, and it's not going to save your farm. It's going to create you some money that's going to maybe, and also some other benefits that will, contribute to the maintenance of a farm. But also, there needs to be some level of getting your core farming business in a good place before we start engaging with these types of things. And some of the other messaging again is around, this idea of public benefits as being the primary driver for any kind of land use decision making is fine, but it's a fairly naive one from a policy stance. That a farmer making a decision about how they manage their land takes in a whole range of different considerations. And sort of the current view in policy is that I've got to deliver some public benefits to get my subsidy payment, and I've also got to be a profitable farm enterprise. But what they forget is that there's a whole range of other kind of motivations among the farming sector for doing certain things. And currently policy is a bit blind to that, all those other things that drive farmer decision making. The other one that I thought about was us as academics, is that often we actually ask the wrong questions. So, I'm periodically bored of seeing people just doing more studies looking at what are the barriers to planting trees on farms. We have a fairly good understanding now of what some of the barriers are, but I'm not really we're not asking why do farmers plant trees. What is it that enables a farmer to make the decision to plant the trees? What is it that enables them then to successfully manage that farm woodland in a way that delivers value to the farm and also to society? So there needs to be a little bit of a shift in the academic sector about what kind of questions we ask and whether they actually have relevance to what's going on the ground. Another one that I sort of jotted down was a lot of the narratives around cultural opposition are fairly constructed. So we did a study a while ago looking at how Farmers Weekly and Farmers Guardian wrote about trees in those two publications. And we typically found there was kind of four main messages that were coming out really frequently about trees. It was, trees are bad because they're basically replacing agriculture. Trees are really bad because they're pushing up land prices. Trees are potentially an opportunity, but it's only slightly weird people that do it. And then there was a final bit of messaging which was, actually, okay, trees is something we could do and it's something that's potentially important to the farming sector. But that final message was absolutely dwarfed by a lot of very vocal opposition to trees. But actually that vocal opposition isn't necessarily indicative of everyone within the sector, whereas Farmers Guardian and Farmers Weekly would have you believe that that was the universal truth about trees in the farming sector, that it was something that everybody was universally opposed to. So a lot of this, a lot of the concerns of a few people are framed as being the concerns of the many, and actually the people that are doing really interesting things are not being kind of showcased. And there's a lot of research that looks into the importance of peer-to-peer learning in the farming sector for distributing ideas and getting ideas out there. But there wasn't really any coverage within the Farming Weekly or Farming Guardian about exciting, interesting things that innovative farmers were doing with trees on their farms. And if they were talking about it, they were framing it as something that was a bit bizarre. So there's a lot of this cultural opposition isn't actually there. It's hiding excitement and energy in the system for actually doing something a bit different. Another one is, again, a lot of the kind of is forgetting that there are people as part of this system. So a lot of research, a lot of policy forgets that there's actually a person running a business, making decisions that affect the livelihood of themselves and their family. And there's quite a lot of research recently that's been looking into kind of mental health among farmers, and actually there's a lot of other research looking at decision making under stress and under pressure in natural resources management decision making, and they typically find that when people are put under undue stress, they make poor natural resource decisions, and that sort of translates into management of farmland and management of sort of woodlands. And what we're forgetting is there is fundamentally some people at the bottom of this, and all of these interventions forget that these people are stressed, these people are running a business, they're dealing with all of the life stresses that all of us are dealing with, but we're kind of throwing information, throwing kind of, you need to do this, you need to do that, and actually we're forgetting that part of the transition is going to be supporting people with making decisions rather than enforcing kind of ideologies and actions upon them. And then the final one is this, there's sort of some scale mismatches in all of this. That we've got this really efficient forestry sector that's set up for dealing with, big plantations, big forestry, big machines going in and taking out loads of timber and it going into big sawmills. But actually, and part of that constructs this narrative that managing these small woodlands is uneconomic. But it's only uneconomic if you're thinking about putting a massive machine into it. And it's uneconomic if you're thinking of putting a massive machine onto a really steep slope. But actually, if you look across the water in Europe, they're managing woodlands on far harder terrain than we do, and they can do it economically. So this idea that managing smaller woodlands is uneconomic is only based on this very static view of how we can manage and harvest woodlands. So part of this transition is going to have to be setting up these smaller supply chains, smaller woodland managers with the specific machines and capabilities to get in and manage small blocks of woodland, perhaps blocks of woodland that are across a number of farms. So you're not filling a single timber lorry from one woodland, but you might fill it up from 5. So it's beginning to rethink how the forestry sector is set up, and there is some really interesting work being done in Wales through an organisation called Wood Knowledge Wales that are beginning to think about how we can set up some of these collective management activities where we take multiple farms and manage them as a single forest unit, and having someone like a small sawmiller being the coordinator of that activity. And I mean, a lot of these issues are the same in farming. Small abattoirs, massive decrease in small abattoirs, massive decrease in small sawmillers. So we can't really have this small scale. I don't want to call it small scale because it's just forestry. We can't have this forestry on a farm without these specific supply chains set up to manage them.
So, Ashley, you covered a lot of ground there, and I'm not going to repeat some of the things that you said, but again, we do talk about quite a lot of that sort of supply chain and the market development. We've kind of lost that sort of ability to deal with anything that isn't large scale of a particular species in the UK, and we're just happy to import all that. So we do talk about that in the report. Just to mention the Farmers Weekly, the study that you were talking about there, I think, was from a couple of years back. Fantastic that the Farmers Weekly have sponsored this event. So we're certainly hoping a lot more positive messages will be coming out in the various farming publications. And as you acknowledged, I think there are those messages. It's just sometimes they kind of outweighed, aren't they, by the weight of the alternative message. But yeah, you also challenged academics, I think, in a little bit in what you were talking about there. So just bring us up to date with exactly what you're doing in Bangor about this topic.
Yeah, so it's actually quite a good time to talk about this because we've just managed to secure some funding and some students to do some really exciting work in this sphere of farm woodlands and how we manage farm woodlands for producing timber and public benefit. So we have a good link with an organisation called Wood Knowledge Wales. They are an organisation that do a lot of work with timber into social housing and turning Wales into a high-value timber nation. So we secured some funding that was to look at 3 different aspects of how do we manage farm woodlands better for producing timber. The first part of that is knowing what we already have. So, traditionally what we do is you go out and measure a woodland, do a traditional inventory and mensuration survey. That's really time intensive. Not everybody has the skills to be able to go and thoroughly inventory a woodland. We've got an academic at Bangor who does a lot of stuff with terrestrial LiDAR scanning, particularly in the Amazon, looking at what drought does to leaf cover in the Amazon. So we're going to take some of that remote sensing expertise and start applying that in a sort of farm woodlandy context, looking at how we can use some of these remote sensing technologies to be able to inventory woodlands, both from aerial LiDAR and ground-based LiDAR, to then be able to rapidly inventory woodland and relate some of those point clouds to be able to work out whether or not there's any kind of valuable timber in that woodland. So hopefully the long-term idea for this project is to be able to create a tool that you can use to rapidly, walk a woodland with an iPhone or whichever one of these new kind of phones that has the LiDAR technology in, to quickly scan a woodland and get an idea of what's in there and what you can do with it. So that's one of the projects we've got going on. We've got another one which is looking at this idea of collective management. So how can we, what is the governance mechanisms that we need to put in place to enable farmers to work together and manage geographically dispersed woodlands in a kind of a mutually beneficial way? So that project's actually, we need a student for that one. So if anyone's interested in coming and doing a fully funded MRes project at Bangor, come and talk to me afterwards. It's going to involve doing some workshops with farmers, groups of farmers that are already doing this, groups of farmers that are thinking about doing it, looking at case studies where it's been done in other spheres. So looking at kind of collective stuff for doing nature, conservation things, farming clusters and things like that. And it's also going to look at how we can involve other parties such as sawmillers, forest agents. How can we set up these networks to be able to allow farmers to work together and manage woodlands collectively? And then the final one is thinking about how do we balance up production and farm level benefits with delivery of public benefits, and then how do we set up the supply chains with that one? So we've got another student looking at doing some interesting modelling using life cycle assessment and ecosystem service modelling to look at where do we need new infrastructure? So where do we need new sawmillers? Where do we need improvements to timber haulage systems and things like that to be able to allow slightly inaccessible places to be managed for timber, and how do we support that and what infrastructure do we need? So that's the kind of really interesting new bits of stuff that we're doing at Bangor over the next couple of years in this sphere.
Fantastic, Ashley. And as a Bangor graduate, it's so heartening to hear that you're getting with it in terms of this very topical agenda. So I didn't have those opportunities when I was there. Okay, thank you for your contributions. I should have said at the start we're aiming to kind of speak for no more than an hour as a team, and give you plenty of opportunity to ask questions and make observations. I don't think David will need that because he's labelled up. So you save your questions for Ashley for after we've heard from the other two speakers. But over to you, David. David is a real inspiration for the report, and hopefully by the end of the next 10 minutes, he'll be an inspiration for many of you as well. Over to you, David.
I'm David Brown. My partner and I trade as broadleaf Wales, and we have a 28 hectare holding in the north of Wales. It used to be a small mixed agricultural holding. It was then deemed to be a non-viable holding by Welsh Government. At the time it was a tenant farm, and it was amalgamated with a neighbouring farm, and my parents bought a house with a pony paddock. As I say, it was considered to be a non-viable holding. In 1993, I was able to reacquire the land. So the land is back to the holding it used to be, and it's now a viable economic holding, and it's achieved that by turning away really from livestock and becoming a predominantly woodland holding. So we started off with a greenfield site with sheep grazed pasture, essentially. The land was absolutely sick of sheep. We started off by getting, if anyone remembers, back to the good old days of headage payments and things like that. We had a quota for a couple of hundred sheep, and it didn't matter what we did, they were sick, they were worm infested, and essentially the land had had enough of sheep. It's fairly steep land, grade 3B, fairly thin soils, very low rainfall, which is unusual for North Wales. But myself and my then partner set about planting essentially broadleaf woodland, site native species for the most part, and trying to grow a resource. In those days it was the woodland grant scheme, so it's a very simple self-administered grant scheme where you mapped your fields, you specified your species mix, and you planted it and you got on with it. And that was what we did, mostly planting at 2,500 stems per hectare, but with a very clear idea that we were going to grow broadleaf species to produce high quality timber. Also to have high amenity value, to have biodiversity value, to have landscape enhancement, the whole suite of benefits which come with growing broadleaf woodland. So there, in the pictures there, we've got, that's a more recent planting scheme there, where I'm taking the guard off that tree in year 3. But we started off using plastic guards, mostly reused plastic guards, which have been reused again. And then we started pruning, and we very soon got into thinning operations. At the time, there was a wonderful grant scheme in Wales called Better Woodlands for Wales, which was a woodland management grant which encouraged all sorts of management practices which would enhance timber value. And the other thing that we were doing was keeping ahead of our threats. So, yeah, we've got a little picture there of squirrel damage. Anyone who's tried to grow broadleaf timber in England or Wales recently will realise that grey squirrels will destroy your efforts unless you do something. That's a very typical picture of a bark stripped, don't know what make it is, possibly a sweet chestnut, but the same sort of damage would appear on birch or oak or beech or sycamore. So pretty much all our native species. So a big part of what we do is grey squirrel control. Livestock is the biggest threat. I mean, it's great to hear about all these people grazing their woodland and what a lovely time their livestock has in their woodland. We do put the cattle in the woodland, but we're talking about maybe maybe a day or two a year. Cattle can do a lot of good in woodland, but they're also, and I'm not sure about sheep in woodland at all, cattle can do a lot of good in woodland. They can open up the tracks, they can knock back the bramble, they can improve access, but we are talking about maybe 24 or 48 hours. So our benefit to our livestock, because we're still livestock farmers, which is great because that still entitles us to a single payment, and it also gets us some funding towards managing the woodlands, which aren't, that sort of funding is difficult to get to if you're not a farmer. And then what else have we got there? Yeah, there's a little picture there of ants doing damage in woodland. I don't know if anyone's come across ants as a problem. You either understand that fully as a tree planter, you think, yeah, I've seen that, or what's he on about? But mounding ants, if they're present in grassland, will use tree shelters as high-rise accommodation. And once they've filled that tree shelter with earth, your tree will die. And the only solution is to get the tree guard off as quickly as possible. So that's just another. Threats to woodland are all about your woodland. It's all totally individual. You've got to assess your own threats. For us, we're using 60 centimetre tree guards when we plant because rabbits are assessed as our biggest danger. But equally, if you've got roe deer or perish of thought muntjac or whatever, then you're dealing with different threats, or hares. So it's all about your own woodland. For our livestock, the benefit comes from having small fields surrounded by woodland. They get a huge amount of shelter, they get a huge amount of shade. Our cattle are outdoors maybe 10.5 months of the year and really enjoy it. And they only come in really when the ground is heavily waterlogged. They're also getting browse, obviously, from the edges. They're benefiting from pruning that we do and feeding forage that way. But we're not, our cattle are not spending a lot of time in the woods. So most of the planting here was done 94, 95, 96, 97. So I noticed somewhere it came on the documents for this show, they've come up with this idea that the best time to plant trees is 20 or 30 years ago. And we're very much in that position of having that woodland resource now and getting increasingly excited about the resource that we've got access to and the timber that we can harvest. If I can run through a few of the pictures there. Charcoal, everybody starts off with charcoal. Your first thinnings, make charcoal. Making charcoal is a great fun job, really filthy, really doesn't pay, but it's a lot of fun. But then we've got into cleaving timber, which is nice, making cleft hurdles. Then we've got into sweet chestnut as a cleft product, and once you've got access to sweet chestnut posts and sweet chestnut rails, you will never go back to tunnelized timber. It is just such an amazing product. We started off using sweet chestnut for ourselves at home, and we now sell about 1,000 pieces of cleft chestnut a year, and we could sell an infinite amount. It's just such a brilliant product. But we went through a phase of hazel basketry because that was the timber that was in our woodland. We were harvesting hazel rods and making hazel basketry and making hurdles. And there's a picture of a yurt there made by a friend of ours using hazel from the woodland. But also that yurt's got a cherry door made from some planked cherry. And the style and the bench are a sweet chestnut, but planked again. We also got some larch, and it's lovely to have larch, and let's hope we don't lose larch as a species. And then we've got some non-timber forest products, of course, nuts, fruit. Ruth's included a picture of her latest enterprise, which is a lovely bit of circular economy where we're controlling fallow deer in the woods, and that's given us deer skins. We can then use wood ash from the stove as a lye to start the treatment of the skins. Then we can use chestnut bark as a tanning agent. So we've got that whole thing where we can produce leather within a closed cycle, which is They're great. So there's just so many things coming out of the woodlands, just so much stuff. And that's only going to increase. And referring to Ashley's comment on this, the problem is there, other than for oak, there's a good market for oak in this country, sawn oak, oak butts, and we've probably only got another 40 years to wait, and we'll be piling into the oak market. But until then, there's almost no demand for minority species in planking. We're planking cherry, and we're planking ash, and we're planking sweet chestnut, and we are waiting for the timber for the furniture makers to arrive. So if you're here, come and talk to us afterwards. But at the moment, there isn't a supply, so there isn't an industry using it, so nobody's milling it, so nobody's seeing it for sale, so there isn't an industry using it. So we're in a completely vicious circle, certainly in our part of the world, where we're having to explore those markets and try and find out what the demand is and what the demand wants. So we're looking into projects like maybe building a solar kiln if people are happier with kiln dried timber, or getting some machinery and maybe some machining wood if people want to buy wood in a more processed state. But at the moment, we're finding there isn't a market for anything beyond the odd board. And equally, again, addressing Ashley's questions here, but there isn't the small machinery. We're really struggling for small machinery, that 4-ton forwarders, things like that. They really don't exist at the moment. So we're forwarding with a manually loaded forwarder at the moment, but that's obviously going to reach constraints as the bits of wood we're moving about get bigger. So learning is the next theme. The next theme slide is learning. There's a little picture there of a demonstration project we've put together at home, which isn't really a demonstration project. It's a bit of housing for somebody, because hopefully we're employing, with the help of the RFS, we're going to be employing a young person next year. So this is some accommodation that they are going to live in the woods. But it's all been built using, apart from the large timbers, which you can't see any of there, it's all been built with timber out of the woodlands. So these are thinnings from a stand planted in 1997, and we're planking timber from there, and that's giving us internal cladding. In that case, that's cherry, but there's also ash. Floorboards, floor joists, the stairs, the kitchen. The whole thing is made out of timber that we're taking out of a very young woodland. And only thinnings. We're not harvesting any final crop trees here. We're only taking out our poorer stems. So that's the sort of thing that we're seeing. That's the sort of thing we're trying to demonstrate with that building, as well as creating somewhere hopefully very pleasant for somewhere to live for a year. So I've always been interested in forestry. I started off, my first job out of school was milking cows in the school holidays, and that led me to the belief that I wanted to be a land manager, and I definitely didn't want to be a dairy farmer. And woodland is what has interested me. But I have no formal training until a few years ago. I went and did a master's at Bangor, a distance learning master's in forestry at Bangor. And there's a little bit of information from the MSc dissertation that I wrote there. One section of which was finding, for instance, that the greenhouse gas benefits of afforestation, so the greenhouse gas benefits of afforestation sheep graze land and turning that into broadleaf woodland was at that stage over 13 tonnes CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. So it's not insignificant. But of course the real benefits, the huge benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from growing broadleaf timber is when you start producing high quality timber which is going to displace energy heavy materials. So instead of using steel girders or concrete floors, we can start planking timber and getting it into enduring end uses is the neat phrase, isn't it? So there's my final graph at the bottom there, which is just showing the time that I think that we've predicted through measuring when the stems of different species will start to reach a target diameter, a diameter which will be really harvesting high quality timber. So for ash and cherry and sweet chestnut, I think we were talking about 50 centimetres diameter of breast height, if everyone's happy with that. Praise as a size of stem. And 60 centimetres diameter for oak and beech. And that graph is showing that 37 years from planting, 38 years from planting, we should be harvesting some really nice timber. So I remember when I first started planting and a neighbour came up to me and said, "What are you planting?" And I said, broadleaf species. And he said, "Well, you won't see anything in your lifetime, will you?" And that, I'm still feeling okay. So I'm very hopeful that I will see some timber harvested. In fact, according to this graph, I'm going to be harvesting some oak in about 2060. I told someone about that recently, and they said, "Oh, you're growing your own coffin boards." And I wouldn't mind that, but I'm sure there's going to be better uses for oak than coffin boards. I'll just go a hole in the ground. That just about wraps me up. The final slide, that's our contact details, that's our website. We do provide woodland management advice, and we do run the occasional woodland management course if anyone's interested in coming along.
Thank you, David. I would definitely encourage you to find an opportunity to visit what David and Ruth have done in North Wales. It really does bust the myth that it's not possible to grow quality hardwood timber in the lifetime of an individual, because David and Ruth are disproving that. But you do have to get a lot of the things right that David's been talking about there. I won't, in the interest of time, I could ask you lots more questions that would kind of open this up, but just read the report. A lot of the things that David's talked about, which are the barriers, we have a big section on that in the report in terms of what needs to happen now to realise these opportunities. But really important to hear from Ollie from the Land Workers Alliance.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Ollie Rodker. I'm one of the co-founders of the Land Workers Alliance. For anyone who's not familiar, Land Workers Alliance is a union of farmers and foresters in this country, about 2,500 members. And I guess what's relevant here is that one of the key founding principles of us 10 years ago was that we wanted to be a union that could work with and represent farmers and foresters, because we wanted to see the end to this historical divide between farming and forestry in this country, which, as was pointed out earlier, is only a recent historical divide, but has still been has been a real barrier. My own background includes woodland management 20 or 30 years ago, some furniture building, a lot of woodwork and timber building, and then now, unfortunately, far too much desk work. And I wish I was out working in the field and in the woods with some more trees. That's my plan for next year. Hopefully you'll never see me again at one of these shows. I'm here particularly to talk about this report, The Cutting Edge. We produced it earlier this year, as Clive kindly said. It's very focused on looking at some practical examples of good, regenerative, ecologically orientated forestry in this country. So I wanted to get away from the theories and look at real people in the real landscape. How are they making a living? What are they doing? What are their barriers? What are their successes? There's 12 case studies in there and a few themes that come out of it. One of the case studies is, in fact, David and Ruth at Broadleaf Wales, so they get the privilege of being in both reports here because they're so great. It's particularly orientated to look at people who are working in these smaller scale farm woodlands, these farm scale woodlands. So a real mixed bag of types of woodlands, not massive scale conventional forestry, harvesting thousands of same species poles, but people who are working with a really mixed woodland environment. Could have been unmanaged for 10, 20, 50, 100 years. Could have seen some heavy management 20 years ago and then nothing. Could be scraps of woodland here, larger scale things there. So and that's representative of farm woodland in this country. It's a real mixed bag, and I think that's partly one of the challenges for us in that sector is to find policies and ways of working together with such a mixed resource. But the people featuring in this report are making all sorts of things. Charcoal, so a few people are making a little bit of money out of charcoal. Firewood, craft products, landscaping products, sawmill timber, obviously. And again, actually, with reference to what David just said about demand, I was actually talking to a forester in South West Wales the weekend. He's got massive demand for the timber, for the softwood sawn timber, that he can't get anywhere near producing what he wants, what people locally want, because they want to buy from someone who's managing woods well in this area, just as more and more people want to buy food that comes from a local, well-managed, healthy, locally focused farm. They want to buy timber from people like that, but there are massive supply chain issues, as is rightfully pointed out. There isn't the match at the moment, but I think that person shows that actually, there is a lot of demand. We've got to solve the problem of supply and get the trees that are growing out to consumers in the market. And there's a whole load of things that we can do around that. Maybe that's something we can talk about in the questions, because I think it's the grit of moving from where we are now to where we need to be in 10 years' time. I will not forget to use this little slideshow. So that's the report. I'm just going to pick out 4 people and just say just one or two things about them. But I've got some copies of the report down here, and there'll be more copies on the Soil Association stand. Clive kindly said we could put some there. So if you want to pick one of these up now, you don't get a chance, get one of those later. Dave is at Middle Ruckham Farm and Forestry. Notice a name on the tin there. He's a mixed holding, pasture with cows and forest, an undermanaged, mainly conifer wood that he took over 20 or 30 years ago. And now actually forestry is his whole business. He's really not his whole business, but it's the majority of his work and his income. And he's making a decent, and not a high, but a decent income off felling 30 trees a year from his wood. So he's got 24 acres, I think. I'll probably forget the numbers, but the wood is growing at about 100 cubic meters of timber. So the total gross volume weight of the trees in his woodland area, very roughly 100 cubic meters a year. He's harvesting about 30 cubic meters of that. So his woodland is putting on value, both income and ecologically, and volume every year. He's taking out 30 trees. How is he making a living out of harvesting 30 trees? Because he's turning them into something. He's not selling them as bare poles or planks. He's making compost toilets, as it happens, for events, for individuals. So he's turning a low-grade conifer pole into effectively a little cabin. So he's turning a pole that is maybe worth a couple of £100 if it's sold on the back of a lorry into something that's worth 2 or 3 grand a time. Now, there's labour and there's time in that, but that's the sort of, that's the core of it essentially. So it's not a huge area of woodland. It's not all in one place, his trees, it's a bit spread out. That kind of situation can be seen on many farms in many parts of the country, small patches of conifer that have become unmanaged or maybe tricky accessibility, not worth putting in a huge amount of money into accessibility, but for a few for a few trees here and there, it's worth going in with a tractor, hand felling, taking them out. Working Woodlands Cornwall, and if I say anything wrong, Tom here is from Working Woodlands Cornwall. I can see him there, so he'll be checking what I'm saying. I think they're doing brilliant work down in Cornwall. I think what's interesting, a couple of things there it's worth saying. Cornwall hasn't got much of a woodland history, a woodland culture, so a lot of their work is about trying to recreate that understanding and working with people about the value of woods and forests. And they're working with some of the Conservation and Wildlife Trust down there to to get into management again some of their areas of woodland. So they're owned by the Trust for nature outcomes, but now with the rotation and a cycle of management that Working Woodlands are putting in there, the trusts are seeing an increase in nature, and it's providing an income and a business and a livelihood for a few people. So there's a lot of skepticism from local people walking their dog in these like conservation woodlands. What are you doing, cutting all these trees down? And they're getting the opportunity to talk to Tom and his colleagues about why it's okay to chop trees down in a conservation woodland and what that can look like, what that can mean, and the benefits that that can have. That doesn't mean that all tree felling is okay. It means that in a carefully managed and rational process, you can bring a lot of extra value. This is Alistair at Underwood Crafts. He's in Derbyshire, and I've just put him in here because he's making a living out of effectively managing coppice at about 5 or 6 acres in total. So he's felling parts of that area in rotation, maybe half an acre a year. He's making a living as a craftsman, making landscaping features, craft furniture, doing schoolwork, hazel hurdles, a mixed bag of sort of traditional craft products for thatching spas, bundles of woodland for environmental management, for flood management, river management, etc. So he's keeping those skills alive on an extremely small area of woodland. And he's no one's making millions out of working with Forestry in this country unless they're at the top of one of the big companies who are probably sponsoring this tent, so I'll be careful what I say. And he's doing it on very small scale, working with farmers who haven't seen any management in their woods for years, maybe generations. And one of his challenges is the security of tenure. So when you're working coppice, you need a rotation. The first year that you cut those coppice stalls, really low quality, low grade poles are going to come out, twisted, bent, angled, not straight, not useful, interspersed with other species. You need a rotation in there, and that takes. Rotation could be 7 or 8 years, could take 2 rotations, it could be 15, 16 years. He needs to have the confidence that it's worth putting in the work on the first rotation, that he's going to get to see the third cut. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, I suppose, or just a lack of understanding from the farming community about what he needs and about how he can work with the woods. And so I think one of the key things we've got to do is build the cultural understanding of how woods can be managed in this country and the benefits that can come from it. It's a great example of somebody who's making a living on a really small acreage. And lastly, Leeds coppice workers. I put them in here, interesting because there's a group of people there in the Leeds wider urban area. Again, they're working a really mixed range of woodlands, some right into the edges of Leeds city, some further out, really mixed bag of woodlands, making coppice products that go all around the country. And really successful in what they're doing in terms of, again, spreading understanding, in terms of being a local business that's providing management for local landowners and providing products for local people at garden centres, etc. But for them, one of their key challenges is having a good processing yard. So they're at the scale. They're not just one person now. They're 8 people, largely variations of part-time. They have quite an amount of volume going through. It's really hard to get a good a processing yard that's affordable for them. They don't have a lot of margins. And what's useful for them is as some of these businesses scale up, what we don't have is the margins in the industry to allow commercial rent of space. And I think that's back to this supply issue. If we're going to really change the dynamics of the timber trade in this country and reduce the imports, that for all the good reasons that we know they have to be reduced, and build up UK supply, we've got to have a range of infrastructure and supply that's going to help. So just a couple of common themes that come out of this report. One, the benefits of an integrated approach. Integrated means that we really can have an approach that looks to nature and environmental and climate issues on one hand, and to economics and viability and livelihood on the other, and can work on both levels. We don't need to have a division in our woods between one or the other. And this report is about showcasing some of the people who are doing that. So Clive said it in his introductory remarks about some of the cultural misconceptions. I think it's really, really important that we challenge that and we say there are people doing it, we need to help them, and we need to help other people who want to do it. Secondly, the importance of firewood. There's been a lot of criticism of burning biomass in the sort of some of the environmental sector and wider, and it's a whole debate. Maybe someone will ask about it and I'll be forced to go into it further. But I think what's worth saying here is that firewood is a really important part of the business of smaller scale operations as they get woods into management. And if we want to see our woods improve in terms of biodiversity, and we want to see our economy using more UK timber, then unless the economic conditions completely change, then firewood is really essential, and we have to find a way to differentiate between that kind of smaller scale local supply of firewood to people who are heating their homes from the industrial monolithic burning of pellets that are imported from overseas and have a lot of political and moral issues with them, let's say. They're not the same thing. Scale is massively important. Thirdly, global trade and UK supply. I touched on it earlier. We can't get away from the realities, and it was mentioned in a session this morning that I passed from the fruit grower, maybe he's in here, was talking in the other tent. They're constantly battling being undermined on price by imports. And it's exactly the same on timber, of course, constantly battling the fact that larger scale operations from different countries are undercutting UK supply. And until we've got a better policy and regulatory environment that can properly certify where timber is coming from and can properly reward UK production, then that is always going to happen while we're part of a global market. And the global market isn't ending anytime soon, but our own position in it definitely can be affected by political issues, as we all know and have seen. And we need to, one of the things I think we need to do as a wider movement is get a better hold on that and push for some better regulation there and some better controls. I end the report with just a few policy sort of pointers. I won't go through them here. There's a whole load of things that need to change if we're going to do the kind of work that we've all talked about here and make it much more wider scale and support the people who want to do it. I think what we see in the Landworks Alliance is that there's a huge thirst for people to just as there is in farming and food, there's a thirst from younger people or people changing careers who want to be involved in restorative, healthy land work. They want to be outdoors, they want to produce something that people need, they want to be constructive, they want to be a part of a solution in a world that has got a lot of problems. But there's a whole set of policy issues and barriers to them being able to do it, and I think that's what we've got to do. On one hand, we get not much help from policy, in my opinion. We have to build things ourselves, as was referred to here. Ashley referred to a programme with the Welsh organisation, looking at how we can help each other and work together better, as well as also being more unified in our approaches towards government and policy at devolved and at the UK level about changing the way that regulation and policy works. Because although individuals can do brilliant things, and they will always do brilliant things, and David is a great example, and there are other people here, if we want the really systemic change, if we want the change to be wider, then it's going to require those kind of wider political changes. We can't do it without that. So I'd just say, if you're not already involved in some part of this, come and talk to us afterwards. Find a way to be part of creating that kind of movement-wide change. Thank you very much.
A lot of the policy points that Ollie's just sort of touched on there, we do pick up on in the report. We kind of analyse this situation as the sort of prevalent model of forestry. It's kind of had 100 years of investment, hasn't it? It's had billions of pounds of investment to kind of make the large-scale plantations that Ashley talked about kind of viable. And then farm-scale forestry gets compared against those plantations and gets written off as uneconomic and unviable. And it hasn't had that same level of focus and intervention. And I think a lot of the things that the Landworkers Alliance are calling for, a lot of the things that the Soil Association and the Woodland Trust, who are obviously jointly organising this show with us, we're all calling for that much more focus on what we're calling the farm woodland resource in the UK. So I'm going to end the discussion from our side there, because we really do want to hear from you now. Either any individual questions for any of us here on the panel, or any kind of contributions, really. Some of you may be doing some of this, and you may have some observations. It doesn't have to be a question.
Hello, yeah, I'm David Barber. I got 70 acres of woodlands in North Oxfordshire. Very similar along the lines to what David's got. I found his talk fascinating. But we found that it's very difficult to make money in these niche ideas like hurdles, etc., because the imported stuff is so cheap. And if you've got to pay someone to make them for you, it's just not on. Luckily, I've got other diversified enterprises that subsidise my woodland efforts. But we are trying to go good timber. We started over 30 years ago, and we are, like that, we've got a small sawmill. We're planking, and I hope we shall sell a little bit of stuff. But I've also got a joinery business, so we're now beginning to use some of my sawn planks in the joinery business. But it's making... I've also got 5 acres of hazel coppice, what's left of it after the deer browsed it dreadfully a few years ago. That's a real pain, looking after the deer, or getting rid of the deer. We got 5 acres of hazel coppice, but it's very difficult to make anything out of it. We sell pea sticks and bean poles and this sort of thing, but the hurdle making just wasn't a runner. So, I mean, if it's your own labour, if it's all coming from David's labour, then that's great, but I'm too old to be making hurdles, and I've got other things to do. And just one other interesting thing I'll point out about the ants in the tree shelters. It's these ecologists you blame for this, because in year 2000 we planted about the last 20 acres I've got in 1.2 metre shelters, all grew away beautifully. And then I had a group of ecologists, because we were spraying around the trees and mowing down the rows. A group of ecologists came around and said, your trees are well established now. Forget about the mowing, let the grass go. It will provide lots of habitat for the wildlife. So we did that, and sure enough, it coincided with a boom year for field voles, and every tree shelter got a field vole's nest in the bottom. And they nibbled them off like a beaver, and I was picking dead trees out of the shelters. So we had to redo it all. Luckily, a lot of the trees coppice, and then, of course, we had the problem of rabbits. But there we are, there's the kind of problems you get. Okay. But this year, I've got the ants. I had to replant an acre of pure ash stand that we planted in 2000. It all got the awful disease, and we felled them all, replanted, using shelters. Same thing happened. I mowed down the rows, sprayed around the trees. And earlier this year, someone from the Forestry came around and said, don't stop mowing down there, let the grass grow, which I have, and now we got ants. There we are. Thank you.
I think a number of observations in there. I mean, maybe pick up with Ollie afterwards in terms of, how to make some of that small-scale coppice practically work. I mean, we're not, as I say, we're trying to paint an optimistic picture, but both organisations have pointed out some of those systemic policy things that need to change. So kind of supporting that whole supply chain, supporting the market development, and basically reconnecting, the resource that we have in the UK with home use, because that has completely been lost and we've become very import dependent.
So can I just add at that point? There are lots of young people out there who want access to the resource. We recently made contact with a coppice worker who's now doing our couple of acres of coppice, which is under management, and he's making a living out of that. The Leeds Coppice Cooperative, they come out of an organisation called the Bill Hogarth Memorial Trust. They're producing skilled graduates of coppice work every year. So if anyone's got a coppice resource, and is, give a young person a chance, because there are people that want to do this, who want to have access to resources and make a living out of it. And if you've got 5 acres of coppiceable hazel, then that might support someone's business.
And Ollie, is that something the Land Workers Alliance can potentially help make those connections between people who want access and...
To some degree, I mean, we're not quite, we don't have the resources to be a properly land matching organisation, but I mean, certainly we have our media. We have means of communication with a lot of people who come on courses. We've just been running some tasted courses, so we have a network of people who are interested in looking, and we do what we can to help, for sure.
Okay. I'm keen to get a few more contributions. A couple of hands at the back. So We'll take the one right at the back first, and then we'll come to gentleman just before.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talks. I'm Ed Hines from the National Forest Company. So for anyone that's not aware, the National Forest is 200 square miles in the Midlands. Planted over 9 million trees in the last just less than 30 years. So we've had to start all of these processes. We were really successful in the early years. It's going to sound quite arrogant. It's not meant to be. We planted lots of trees and then realised that none of them were being managed. So for the last 11 years, we've had a dedicated management grant scheme, and our woods in management have now reached above 80%. And along with that has developed wood networks, businesses, farm diversification, all of those things that highlighted. The report seems brilliant as well. I've only skimmed through it, but if anyone wants to talk about what we've done or what we are doing, then happy to talk afterwards. It's not really a question, it's just a...
No, but that just gives me an opportunity to mention one of the solution, or one of the kind of policy interventions that we're arguing for in the report, which is, there still is this obsession on planting trees, but really we need to match it now with, the growing of trees and the using of trees, and the resources need to shift, and that's not going to be very easy politically, because that's what we get measured on, is the trees that are planted in the ground. But it's fantastic to hear that National Forests, who are doing that at scale, that you've really now turned your attention to that. So well done.
Yeah, and we are fortunate. You're right. We've got a boundary, so with 200 square miles, a fixed area that we can focus on, and we've got staff, myself included, who can focus on landowner management advice. If anyone's interested in a job in the National Forest, we have got a post open at the moment, so I'll leave it at that.
People competing to offer jobs here. That's great.
Is it
Tom?
Sector.
Tom in the... Yeah.
Hi there. One of the sort of interesting topics when it comes to resources that I think is a real, something that's maybe not tapped into so much these days, is the fact that most farmers are old, and their children are maybe looking at ways to still be working on the farm, but obviously current farming models are pushing towards less people on the land, more mechanisation. And I think small or farm woodland scale things is quite an exciting way for young people, or even a lot of the children of farmers aren't even that young these days, and maybe have done other jobs and are coming back to reconnect with the land like Matt was earlier on. I just wonder, from your point of view, when you're bringing in farm woodland into management, obviously there's a lot of labour in there, but what are the sort of really key products that can form the basis of businesses or can supplement farm businesses?
Well, I'm going to hand over to David and Ollie on this. I've got a few observations myself, but I'm not doing this for real. I'm doing a lot of thinking and talking about it. So, David, what's your base product? I think that's what Tom's asking.
So at the moment we're sort of looking around. We've got 20 hectares of woodland. It's a tiny patch, and there's so much work in there and so much potential employment in a thing like that. So we've recently recruited a potter just randomly, but maybe there's going to be wood-fired pottery in there. We've got a coppice worker who's interested and is spending some time. But really, what we've got is timber. And timber is sawn timber is the primary resource. Sawn or cleft timber is the primary resource. And it is such a huge resource. And we've just got out of the habit of using broadleaf timber in this country. It's a tradition that's stopped, from my perspective. And that's what we need, is people, we need young people. We need young people, and we need rural housing, absolutely, isn't it? It's all about having jobs, and they're not going to be well-paid jobs. They're going to be jobs which are going to need people to make their own living out of the resource, but the resource is there. But rural housing is just this huge barrier to young people being able to live and work in the countryside. Does that answer any of it?
Not exactly.
No.
After products that you can get whilst you're bringing in a woodland into management, there's timber there, but initially there's not.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you make your living until you get to that timber point.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great thing with the coppice workers, the Bill Hogarth crowd. What they're saying is create a resource and the market will arrive. But even within a coppice, as we were saying, within a coppice regime, you've got you harvest rubbish and then you've got 7 years to wait. And how do you bridge that gap, isn't it? People ask you to look at their woodland, say, I want to bring my woodland into management. Yeah. How much money am I going to make this year? And you say, well, you're harvesting the rewards of 30 or 40 years of neglect. There isn't a reward to be had in most woodlands which have been neglected. And bridging that gap is really difficult.
Ollie, you must have something to add.
I mean, it's hard in the first few years for sure, and that's why firewood does some of that heavy lifting in terms of the viability of a business, because there's a lot of product that is really not going to be fit for much else. But woods are so different, so it's really hard to make generalisations. It depends a lot on your species mix. But there are fencing products and gates and sort of basic farm equipment is a stalwart of some of the businesses in here and other people. Say it with Wood in Herefordshire, they're employing a dozen people now, sending gates and farm wooden farm parts, if you like, all over the country. There's small diameter poles is useful for building, if we're talking about in the sort of first 20 years, some conifer poles can produce useful building timber, particularly for events and shorter lifespan things, but also now beginning to be more. Now there's more interest in ecological building. I mean, as David just said, I think it's a huge potential growth. It's about growth potential as an industry of how we can use the timber products in this country to better support a UK housing industry and base it on timber, which sequesters carbon, rather than on concrete, which emits it. So some of this stuff is at the beginning, I would say, of sort of awareness and familiarity, but there are people doing it. But it is a really mixed bag. I don't think there's one thing that you could say that's the thing you should do, because every woodland is different. Some people are going for the coppice, the sort of coppice products, and that's if there's a hedging or a thatching industry locally, or if there's environmental management issues locally, that's got more potential. If there's a garden centre sort of market for UK products around garden equipment, there's plenty of people making money out of those very small diameter rods, making things for them. So I mean, it's a mixed picture, and there's not a silver bullet, I don't think.
And if you've got sweet chestnut,
maybe you've got your eye on there is a silver bullet.
Well, no, I don't think there is a silver bullet. But obviously, I mean, firewood is the main crux of my business in Cornwall, and firewood is expensive these days. So, and fencing is expensive. All wooden products, the price of them are going through the roof. That's great for woodland businesses, but for farmers who are heating their big, poorly insulated houses with wood. Then if they can make savings by producing their own firewood, fence posts, tannalised fence posts last 3-5 years in the ground. If you have some chestnut coppice, or if you stick some robinia in the ground, it's ready in less than 10 years. I think making savings before farmers, I'm a bit of a farmer myself, but are often keen to see where the cash is, but the savings are just as vital. And with wood, probably you get more money by the savings, I think, than you do from cash products.
Yeah. Again, that's a theme we do profile in the report, this kind of on-farm use, so it doesn't necessarily have to be about off-farm sales. And if you've got some sweet chestnut coppice if you're lucky enough to have some sweet chestnut coppice on your farm, you can do something quite quickly probably with that. Okay, keen to get a couple more questions before we wrap up. So the gentleman in the shirt, the nice shirt at the front here, a bit like mine.
How are you going to attract people to come and work in the sector, to do the mainstream chainsawing, forwarding, etc., to get these farm woodlands into shape?
Well, yeah, let's hear from Ashley on that. Yeah.
So the ICF recently have just started a big push for
Say who ICF is.
It's the Institute of Child Foresters. I've just started a massive push working with FE colleges, HE colleges, getting into schools, trying to get the word out about forest management generally as an industry. I mean, a good example the other week was we had some coverage in BBC News about the opportunities for working in the forest sector. And then a week later, we had a student come knock on the door and said, I saw the piece in the news about managing woodlands and the excellent opportunities for working in the forest sector. And she during clearing, switched from doing a geography degree to come and do a forestry degree. So we're seeing the numbers are growing with students coming into Bangor to do the forestry degrees that we put out. The only problem there is for actual getting people on the ground on the tools is that we're pitching people probably into the kind of, for want of a better word, into the kind of management levels of Tilhill and other companies like that. So from our perspective, that's great, and we're doing what we need to do. But the big problem is getting people onto the machines. And I was at an event with the RFS up at Cleveland College a couple of months back, and the schools all came and said, "Oh, we think forestry is a fairly unskilled job." So they brought all their kind of, this sounds really bad, but they brought their sort of fairly low achieving students, and and eventually they came out of this and went, "Oh, actually, we really should be bringing our really bright students that that want to work outdoors and want to, that can really engage their brains in managing these natural resources." So there is stuff going on. The ICF are doing a big push. They've just published a big thing through the Forest Skills Forum, looking at varying different interventions. I mean, the apprenticeships through the Forestry Commission is another way in. But I mean, there's all these things happening, but there is still so much more ground that needs to happen.
Thanks, Ashley. I could bring Ollie in on that, but talk to Ollie afterwards on that. But there was two other hands that I was keen that we took. So the gentleman on the right and this gentleman here on the left. And then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Will from Scottish Forestry. I was just wondering, you've touched on kind of the issues of international trade and potential policy changes, but I mean, how would you envisage actually having an impact on that? Obviously, EUTR, or whatever it's been rolled into now in the UK, and well, that should be having an impact, and FLEGT could kind of exacerbate the issue. So, I mean, how do you actually...
We're not trying to influence that timber legality point that you're pointing to there in terms of regulation. I think the main sort of argument we're making in the report is we need to have much more of a focus on the timber supply chain and the processing sector for the type of trees that are in the woodlands that we're talking about here. If you contrast it with the £1 billion of investment that went into being able to realise benefits from our plantation resource in the 20th century, we're just calling for a fraction of that to make some of these inroads and try and break out of this vicious circle that we're in at the moment. Happy to talk to you about that a bit more, but one last question and then we're going to have to...
Yeah, it was just an observation and a challenge, I suppose. The observation I've sort of picked up from this morning is that two things really. One, we often talk about neglected woodlands, and also we talk about high value oak saw logs, and we all know that those two don't go together. There's a French forester, Jean Lemaire, who's written a book that's been translated into English about growing oak in 100 years, and I fortunately read that a year or two ago, and over that 100 years it requires inputs and little bits of intervention throughout the length of the crop. And so I suppose it brings me on to the challenge, how do we keep that going on these farm woodlands, and how do we prevent the farm gate being shut? Because really neglected woodlands is in effect having the farm gate shut for a number of years that then compromises the timber. I'm not sure, is there a resource out there for farmers that they can just put in their information and quite quickly get information back what they should be doing in real time? Because at the moment I feel as though in 100 years' time we will still be talking about neglected woodlands and how we bring them back into management, and the challenge is keeping that woodland constantly managed over decades in effect.
Yeah, I'm going to have to not allow to open that up to the panel because we all need to get you out of this hot tent. But I think what we're really trying to argue here is that the woodland becomes another farm enterprise, and therefore it does have that continuity of management. Nobody's pretending that it isn't long term, or it's clearly not operating on the same cycle as livestock or crops. But just in the ways that those produce commodities and production from a farming system, what we're talking about here is that trees sit alongside that really, and also get managed in that way and thought about in the longer term as part of the overall farm enterprise. none of us will be here in 100 years' time, but I really hope we're not still talking about this in 100 years' time and that we've found a way to crack it. One final thanks to our great panel today, but also thank you to you for being in this hot tent for an hour and a half and sticking with it. Many thanks.
Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Sainsbury's, and our other major sponsors, Farmers Weekly Transition, Forestry Commission, and Tilhill, and all the attendees for making this show such an overwhelming success. To get advice and support for your agroforestry project, either visit woodlandtrust.org.uk/plant or soilassociation.org/agroforestry.